Today on Market Journal, you've heard us talk about using cover crops during the off-season, but what about while you're growing corn? We'll look at how interseeding might work for you. And our marketing analyst is breaking down selling opportunities for old crop and new crop. Here are his recommendations. Plus, gypsum may be more commonly associated with plaster and drywall, but its use in agriculture can increase yields and improve soil. We'll explain. This week's edition of Market Journal starts right now.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Glad you're able to spend a little bit of your day with us. We've got a good show on tap for you this week. And beginning the broadcast, as corn and soybean growers get ready for harvest, winter wheat producers are already looking ahead to next year. Dr. Nathan Mueller is an extension agronomist and certified crop advisor who helps growers in eastern Nebraska. He told me wheat yields ranged from 60 to 100 bushels this year, which is in line with averages he's seen. Additionally, he offered some advice to come out ahead when selling the crop.
We had an advantage here in Dodge and Washington County, Fremont. The Schooler elevator has a pretty good basis, sometimes 40 cents over futures, which is really strong and pretty unique for the area. But quality is really important. So they want the test weight, they want the protein. If you don't have those, there's also a dock for it. So it's something, there's some incentives there, but quality is going to be important. So that's something that I do talk with growers about. Both test weight being one of the first things, and then managing protein as well, so they can get some extra cents per bushel with a protein premium.
And whether you grew wheat or are preparing to harvest something else, Nathan says to stay on top of your soil management. A big part of that is fall soil sampling every 3 or 4 years. Sample in different spots across your fields, and then make adjustments to your soil fertility program.
Remember, the amount of nutrients we remove per acre changes every year because the amount we're removing is in the seed itself. So if yields are up, yields are down. If we're removing something as a corn silage versus just the seed, nutrient removals is different. And so tracking that, probably one of the biggest issues in fertility management in east central Nebraska is actually soil pH. With a lot of land being cash rented, high cost of production, a lot of people don't want to spend money on lime. The landowner doesn't want to spend money on lime, with high property taxes. But man, that can really short us on soybean yield. We've seen that in some on-farm research data looking at the value of lime in this area. Some huge yield responses in soybeans in some years in corn. So having a pH of 5 is really going to hurt you. If we can get those pHs 6.5, I think that's something that we need to look at more than just focusing on phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, and zinc.
Of course, nutrient application is always important too. Getting that on the soil before the ground gets too cold will help in the long run.
In terms of ag lime or Pell lime in the fall application is going to probably be an advantage to get that on before the ground freezes so it can start to react, especially if we're going to go to soybeans. Ag lime can take up to 2 years to react. In terms of phosphorus, I think that my biggest concern is just getting it on before the ground freezes. Fertilizer applications, dry fertilizer on top of frozen ground is just a little bit higher risk, especially with the snow melts that we had this year on top of frozen ground. Some of that dry fertilizer you put on could end up running off, being dissolved, and not there for the crop. And the other big piece we forget about fertility is making sure we're protecting the soil, because a lot of our nutrients are in that top inch. If we have soil erosion, either whether it's due to tillage or high rainfall events, just realize that you're also losing a very valuable part in your fertility program as well.
Nathan tells me that if you're struggling from a profitability standpoint, you might want to consider introducing livestock or a different crop onto your farm. He also encourages you to network with as many growers as you can and learn together as peers. Great advice. Moving on, and one of the major benefits of cover crops is weed management. But rather than wait until the off-season to implement your cover crop plan, New research shows that interseeding cover crops with the cash crop can help reduce herbicide injury, and it won't impact yield. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh has the story.
Cover crops have been the talk of the town for the past few years. But as Nebraska Extension's Chris Proctor is researching, interseeding your cover crops within your cash crop can have even more benefits than planting post-harvest.
You think cover crops in general, it's trying to establish a cover crop primarily for these ecosystem services we like to talk about. And so again, soil erosion, capturing excess nutrients so they don't leach out of the system, suppressing weeds. And so when you're thinking about growing biomass, biomass is primarily driven by water, light, nutrients, heat, temperature. And so as you get later and later in the season, when you think about establishing a cover crop after harvest, the conditions are less conducive for plant growth. And so the benefits of interseeding are you're trying to capture part of that growing season when it's more conducive for cover crop growth. So.
It's not just as easy as dropping a few seeds on the ground. When it comes to planting, there are two ways to get the job done.
When we talk about interseeding, there's really two types of interseeding. There's a broadcast interseeding, and so this would be flying over with an airplane or a high clearance machine that would just drop the seed right on the surface. And this can be done at a number of different stages, whereas there's more and more research and equipment development. We're looking at drilling cover crops into a growing crop, and so there's high clearance drills that are being used, and that's where interseeding is usually done a little bit earlier. And the advantage of drilling over broadcast, drilling puts the seed down in the soil where you get better seed to soil contact and typically you get better germination emergence, where broadcast is really reliant on having some kind of rain event or precipitation available to that crop. So if it's really dry after you broadcast, typically established is poor. And so you're much more tied to environmental conditions with broadcast interseeding.
And just like with most things in the ag industry, timing is key to a successful season.
Most of the research done on interseeding, there's a balance that has to take place. So if you interseed too early, that cover crop tends to compete with either the corn or soybeans, and that would result in yield loss. And so most of the research done has shown that interseeding between V5 and V8 in corn is really the ideal window. If you can interseed in that window, typically there isn't any effect on the corn yield. That window is so short. If you think on corn from V5 to V8, that doesn't give you a very wide window, and if weather isn't cooperating, you can see how you can miss that window really quickly. And so really you want to have your seed ready and make sure your equipment's ready to go. I would say by kind of that V3, that really early season stage. So if you think I want to get in the field at V3 and the weather keeps you out, the likelihood you'll be in there by V5, V8 is ideal. And so I would back up a little bit, make sure you're ready to go so that when that window hits, you can get out in the field. For broadcast, I think it's the window's a little bit wider. There's growers that are interseeding V5, V6 stage of corn a little bit later, and I think the flexibility at that time is a little bit broader, so it's probably not quite as critical.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Chris and his team got a new interseeding machine near the end of the season. He says he's excited to use it in the upcoming years to continue his research. Next up, last week, Extension Plant Pathologist Dr. Tamra Jackson-Ziems updated us on end-of-the-year corn diseases. Physoderma Brown Spot is another of those diseases that's come as a surprise to many producers.
So today we've been talking about a number of different diseases. One of them has been more severe this year and maybe caught some people by surprise. That one is Physoderma Brown Spot. And this one can be confused with a number of other diseases and often develops quickly. And so the way you would recognize that disease is that you often have yellow to orange lesions on the blade of the leaf. Oftentimes they're in bands across the leaf, but where they cross the midrib, there's a much darker lesion in that midrib. It may be black or dark purple. Well, this year we've seen those dark purple or black lesions developing on a lot of the leaf sheaths and on the husks and everywhere on the plant. And in a few cases, we've got documented that we're seeing brittle stalk development because those spores infect all the way around the node. And in some cases it makes it brittle, and wind or just simply pushing on them will cause them to break over. And so if producers across the state know they had a lot of Physoderma brown spot, it would be worth their time to go out in the field as we approach fall and start pushing on them to identify if any of them might be prone to breaking over. And if they find a high incidence of that, they should probably treat it like they would stalk rot and consider harvesting those fields first before they succumb to wind or other damage.
Remember, you can send in samples to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic if you need help identifying diseases in your fields. More information on that can be found on the Market Journal website. Time for markets now, and let's get a quick check of what we got going on this week. We're going to continue our conversation with Jeff Peterson of Heartland Farm Partners. As we close in on harvest, some folks still have old crop that needs to be sold. So what does Jeff recommend?
Yeah, you know what, this is an area, and I know prices are down dramatically from where we were at before. You don't want to panic and sell in here. I'm not saying we found the very low price yet, but we're in the process of finding it. So I think if you need to move those bushels, the first thing you need to do is say, okay, can I get them moved into town? And there's some very good basis levels out there. There's some processors and some elevators that need some corn. If you can get that put on a basis contract, the nice thing about that is that would allow you to not have any storage. It would also allow you to pick up maybe upwards of a 70% advance of funds on those bushels, and it would also give you the ability to not set the futures price till sometime down the road. And so I think that would be something you could do. If you weren't able to utilize a basis contract, I mean, you could always go ahead and sell it and re-own on the board, or re-own with options would be a couple other alternatives. But I wouldn't panic selling here on corn or the bean side.
All right, so that's old crop. But what about new crop, as far as when there might be that next opportunity to price some additional sales? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question, you know, and that's the hard part, is that nobody probably has enough sold, and this isn't an area on the new crop side to sell either. What I would do is I'd wait. I think as we get the combines in the field on both the corn and the bean side, what I think we'll find is I think they will find less yield, and as a result I think we'll have a chance to see the price come up. I think that will give us an opportunity then to make some additional sales on the new crop side. But something I want to kind of get us to think a little bit about is that the 2020 crop, you know, I know that seems like a long ways out to even be thinking about, but what I do think is that if bean prices stay where they're at relative to where corn is, there's going to be a lot of potential corn acres that could come into play next year, and especially in all this prevent plant acres that are out there. So I think we may end up having to look to go ahead and get some of that 2020 crop priced much earlier than what we'd normally find most years.
And then looking a few weeks down the road, we've got the quarterly grain stocks report at the end of the month. Anything you're looking for here that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I think that's going to be an important one for us to watch, because we're going to get a better handle then of actually where our stocks are at, and that's always a good one to get behind us. I think the other thing about that particular report this year is that there won't be a lot of commingling of old crop and new crop, because honestly there won't be by that time probably a lot of new crop harvested yet, because this crop is behind. Mm-hmm. And so it'll also give us a feel of kind of what the feed numbers are doing, what the livestock numbers are doing in regard to how much they're eating. So I think that's something we'll watch and get a good feel. Then we'll be able to really decide, okay, where are we at basis-wise in the individual states, because we'll have a better idea of what the stocks are like because of that report, and then we'll be set to go ahead and move forward from there.
And anything you want to mention as far as risk management or marketing advice that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, I think this is just a good time of the year. Just, you know, dust off that marketing plan that you had out there. Make sure you kind of update all your break-evens and know where you're at, and run through some scenarios now that you're getting out in the field, actually able to see what some of those yields are as you do some estimates, and then when you get the combines in, and really understand where you're at on how many bushels are going to have to move to town, because there's going to be some opportunities on basis. I think for harvest basis, you know, at some point in here we're going to have to get that locked up, but anything post-harvest I'd be a little bit patient on yet.
Always appreciate Jeff joining us on the show. Time now for this week's trivia question, and getting closer and closer to harvest, so we got a harvest question for you this week. How many acres of dry edible beans does Nebraska harvest each year? Is it 100,000 acres, 110,000 acres, 125,000 acres, or is it 150,000 acres? Make your selection, and I'll have the answer after Al's forecast. Next up, Nebraska and Arkansas don't share a border and are separated by about 300 miles. But there's at least one agricultural challenge the Cornhusker State and the Natural State have in common: glyphosate-resistant weeds, in particular Palmer amaranth. University of Arkansas weed scientist Dr. Jason Norsworthy recently discussed managing the pigweed at a glyphosate-resistant Palmer amaranth management field day in Carlton, Nebraska. With the right approach, Norsworthy says growers can be successful in keeping Palmer amaranth at bay. In the September Nebraska Farmer, read about 3 don'ts, or 3 lines of defense, Norsworthy outlined for managing Palmer amaranth. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Good to see you, Al. Give us an idea of what we've got in the forecast as we head into fall.
Well, Troy, just to be on a more serious note, it does look like we are going to deal with some more active weather here as we go into the fall period, and we're seeing that already starting up over this last week. And my suspicion is that we will have something similar to some of the conditions we felt last fall with these troughs coming in the western United States. I just think we're going to see the placement of the heavier precipitation a little bit farther north than we've seen last year. And we've seen that already this week, as I said. Very heavy rainfall across the Dakotas, northern Nebraska, yet as we got towards southern Nebraska, kind of a hit and miss depending on where you were at. Some were winners and some were losers, unfortunately, in this precipitation game. And of course, we had to deal with the strong winds and hail. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, with another long wave trough coming into the western United States, it is going to result in some warmer weather this next week, but again, we're going to start to increase our thunderstorm chances as the week progresses, and potentially seeing some more heavy precipitation across the Dakotas, Minnesota, portions of Iowa, and potentially north central and northeastern Nebraska once again. So as we go to the upper models, we'll notice that we have a little zonal flow with just a little wave that has been moving through the region and is starting to head toward the Great Lakes. Our next big system that will enter the United States is basically coming into the western United States, and we have a surface low pressure in eastern Dakotas this morning. And we do have the opportunity with that low pressure system around to see some isolated thunderstorms in eastern Nebraska, but they'll be very isolated. Then on Sunday or tomorrow, we see this big trough digging that's going to pump a lot of warmth air back into our region, and we're going to return to normal to slightly above normal temperatures. As we go into the latter half of the weekend, there is still the chance for some thunderstorm activity, but most of it looks like it's going to be over Iowa. Then on Monday, this trough really deepens. That's going to bring a very warm fetch of air from the southwest and at the surface from this Gulf of Mexico. So that's going to bring the humidity levels up, and temperatures are going to move back well up into the mid to upper 80s with some 90s in the southwest possible. Most of the precipitation will remain to the west of us. But on Tuesday, we start to see a first piece of energy moving out of that trough, and that's going to support this upper or this surface low over the Dakotas. So deep fetch of moisture moving northward, but most of the impacts will be felt across the northern Rockies, less so as you move east of the Rockies. By Wednesday, this low begins to pivot toward the Great Lakes. That's going to increase the energy coming from the southwest to the central plains. Low pressure develops over the Texas Panhandle and the Nebraska Panhandle. And the initial wave looks like it's going to generate moisture across the eastern half of the state with the best opportunity across northwest Iowa and points to the north. On Thursday, this trough starts to open up, and we see a low pivoting out of that at the surface over southwestern Kansas. That should bring a deep fetch of moisture into our region, and we'll see a pretty good complex of thunderstorms. Right now it's painted over Iowa. I would not be surprised that we'll see some of it back up toward eastern Nebraska. And then on Friday, we finally start to see this trough lifting up toward the northern plains. Surface low over central Nebraska is projected to form along with northeastern Wyoming. That should generate some very heavy precipitation, unfortunately, for those areas that have been hit so bad this last week with heavy precipitation. Lesser amounts as you move toward the Kansas-Nebraska border. And if we look at the long term, which takes us from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, with that trough in the upper atmosphere moving up into the northern plains, we still expect most of the period to average above normal, although this will start to bring some cooler weather and below normal temperatures to the northern plains, so this might be extended a little bit farther toward the east. In terms of precipitation, of course, with a trough to our west, ejecting systems out on a continual basis, a good bet that we're going to see above normal moisture. The best area for above normal risk for high moisture is eastern Nebraska, although this may be pivoted just slightly to our east. So overall, this next week, we are looking at warmer temperatures. We are going to see an increasing chance for thunderstorm activity as we move through the week. and then that system will clear us as we get into next weekend, and we'll watch for cold air developing to move down the last full week of September. So Troy, looks like, at least from a perspective for the corn reaching maturity, we have some favorable weather ahead of us, but cooler weather is in store as we move to the last full week of the month.
Thanks, Al. Back to trivia now, and this week we asked, how many acres of dry edible beans does Nebraska harvest each year? The answer is C, 125,000 acres. That's about 1 billion servings. Nebraska ranks first in production of Great Northern beans and second in production of all dry edible beans. That's pretty cool. For our final story today, gypsum is a versatile mineral that can be used for manufacturing wallboard, cement, and plaster, to name a few. But get this, it can also be used as a fertilizer. Dr. Warren Dick of Ohio State University joined me to discuss his research on gypsum and provide some insight into its impact on agriculture.
Gypsum is a mineral. It's a naturally formed mineral, naturally found in the environment. It's calcium sulfate. So it incorporates or has two essential elements, calcium and sulfur. And one of the things to know about gypsum is it's moderately soluble, and it's not completely soluble, but it is much more soluble than lime, which is another calcium source. We say it's about 200 times more soluble than lime. And that's very important because it helps that calcium move down into the profile where it can do some very beneficial things for our soil.
And what I think is pretty cool, your research looks at how gypsum can be applied to agriculture. So why is that something that could be beneficial to ag?
Sure. Well, I already mentioned that gypsum contains two essential elements. So I'm going to talk first of all about sulfur. When I started work on gypsum and actually on sulfur in general, people were saying, Warren, why are you doing this research? There's no such thing as sulfur deficiencies in this country. But as we went through the Clean Air Act and we started scrubbing the sulfur out of our flue gases when we were burning our fossil fuels, all that free sulfur we were getting in our rainfall went away. And so we were removing more sulfur every year from our crop harvest. We were leaching more sulfur. We weren't getting as much in the rainfall anymore. So now many states are starting to report deficiencies of sulfur in their crops. And one of the really good sources of sulfur is gypsum. And of course, then the other side of this material is the calcium. And calcium is very beneficial as far as rooting of crops. Soil physical properties, helps the infiltration of water and air, aggregates the soil so that infiltration can become more efficient. And so those are some of the benefits that can be captured by applying gypsum to ag soils.
And your research also talks about gypsum, using gypsum generated from smokestacks of coal plants and putting that toward agriculture. So how do you turn it from what comes from the smokestack to what you're going to end up putting toward your field?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When you burn a fossil fuel that has sulfur and you scrub that sulfur out, for example, if you burn coal, a lot of the coal ash removes all those heavy metals and things you don't want. The gases continue to go up through a series of, eventually through the smokestack, but as it's going to through that process, it's bubbled through a calcium lime slurry. And that sulfur reacts with the calcium to make this gypsum, calcium sulfate. So it's quite pure material. It's got very uniform size, and it's a very good beneficial material for ag materials. It's also used, of course, to make wallboard in construction, but ag has certainly become another important market for this material. The problem is nowadays, however, though, as there's more pressure to remove coal as a source of fuel in our country, farmers are wanting gypsum, but it's becoming a little bit harder to find. So maybe the mine source will become more important as we continue down this road. But the material from these power plants has been a very good source of gypsum over the past few years.
And when you're talking about using gypsum in ag, I'm sure a lot of folks wonder, okay, how would that impact the water quality when it's going down into the soil? Could you speak on that a little bit?
Yes, the way it does is the calcium, well, two ways. One is the calcium helps aggregate the soil, allows much better water infiltration into the soil, so you don't get as much runoff. A lot of the phosphorus that ends up in our lakes piggybacks on sediment that's eroded. So if you can get more water going into the soil instead of running off the soil, you decrease the amount of erosion and sediment movement. But the other thing is, especially where we're moving more into no tillage, and all the fertilizers are applied on the surface, or even with the 4Rs, maybe under the surface, but never, the soil is never tilled, you do get a buildup of available phosphorus at the surface. And that can be a good thing for, in some cases, it helps feed the plant. But every time it rains, some of that phosphorus becomes dissolved, gets into the tile drainage or the surface drains into our rivers and lakes, and it's that available soluble phosphorus which really fuels eutrophication, or that algae formation in our lakes. And so what gypsum does is the calcium reacts with the phosphorus, makes calcium phosphate, keeps that phosphorus, that soluble phosphorus, on the field where you want it. It's still available for plants. The soil test values really don't change a whole lot, so the plants can still take it up, but you're really improving the water quality coming off the fields because you're not having the soluble phosphorus no longer in that water that's coming off the field. So that's how that gypsum really helps provide a benefit. And I know there's government programs, some government programs where they are actually cost sharing with farmers to apply gypsum to their soils, especially where there's very heavy phosphorus movement, to help improve the water quality coming off those fields.
Oh, very interesting. So have you found any drawbacks to using gypsum in agriculture?
There are drawbacks, just like anything else. You have to use it effectively and properly, especially on sandy soils. If you apply too much gypsum, that calcium will knock off all your magnesium and other required cations, and so you can get a very imbalanced cation and anion nutrient profile in your soil, and that can cause problems. So you really have to make sure you understand where it's appropriate to use, what is the appropriate rate, so that you don't end up with these imbalances and causing these problems that can occur when you use gypsum as a soil amendment.
Despite the fact that gypsum has been around for over the last 2 centuries, we're still studying its benefits. Good information from Warren. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, we'll be bringing you coverage from what we saw at Husker Harvest Days. Learn how to keep the soil healthy pre- and post-harvest. Hear how to get the best yields from your corn and soybeans, and check out some of the latest harvesting technology. All that and so much more. We'll see you next time. I'm Troy Moeling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.